everyone. We are the Natural Language Processing for Online Peer Support Group. I'm Kelly McMeekin.
I'm Shweta.
I'm David Wang.
Our apparently very proud team leads are Dave and Tim right there. And our data scientist is Valentina, who is right there. 1 in 4 young adults is affected by mental illness every year. In the last 10 years, the rate of major depressive episodes has increased by 67% for those between the ages of 18 and 25. This age demographic is now the group with the largest or highest rate of mental illness. And yet, they're also the group that is the least likely to have received mental health services. So we have a big problem that needs a big solution. And no surprise, tech steps in. In the last 5 years, the number of apps and sites that are targeted towards mental health and proclaim to help mental health has increased dramatically. Some of these platforms offer professional counseling, while others offer AI chatbots, discussion forums, peer support, or even games. This summer, we specifically looked at one aspect of mental health care, which is peer support. For those of you who are unfamiliar, here's a kind of working definition. Peer support is when people provide knowledge, emotional support, or practical help to each other based on a shared experience of emotional or psychological pain. It is the common experience that makes peers qualified to assist one another, although in some instances, peer counselors or peer supporters do also receive additional training. Of course, as you would expect, when you have peers that are supporting one another, some attempts are more helpful than others. And that brings us to our guiding research question this summer. What types of responses are the most helpful to individuals sharing their mental health struggles online? The deliverable for our project was explanatory research. We were looking to examine a question that is an emerging field that has not yet been well studied. In order to answer this question, we studied an online peer support platform for mental health who provides mental health support to those who need it. The goal of our research on this specific platform was to then provide them with actionable suggestions for how to encourage more helpful comments on the platform. The platform provided us with restricted access to a database of over 200 million rows of public conversations, user behavior, and demographics. The data consisted of over 500,000 users, the majority of whom are female, and a median age of 19. The platform is maintained and supervised by fewer than 50 admins and moderators. On the platform, users can create posts which they categorize by mood and category. Other users can then comment on the posts, and the original poster can then choose to engage with any of the commenters by responding back, liking a comment, following the commenter, or directly messaging them. To take us a bit deeper into the data, I'll hand off to my colleague David.
One of the first things we realized when we started looking at this platform is that actually it's not just about mental health, that many of these platforms are actually a mix of social media, discussion of music, as well as mental health. So the first thing we did was we narrowed down our data set to what we thought was the mental health portion of the platform. And in total that gave us around 2 million question and comment pairs to examine. And one of the things that we really struggled with is how do we wrap our minds around this many comments and questions? That ideally we want a framework to understand what types of problems people are experiencing, as well as being able to attach a label to them so that they might be able to be directed in the future. So one of the things we did was we used a technique called topic models, which what it does is take words and looks at their co-occurrence in posts and maps them into unsupervised categories. And what we found was that the top post, the most common type of post was an expression of despair. And just to give you a brief flavor of that, we have a sample below. Sometimes I get so lonely I can't help but feel sad, and then I'm angry for being that way. I want you to take a moment to think about how would you respond to an individual who expresses that sentiment. They posted it on a forum, you might not know anything about them. What type of response do you think might be appropriate? Well, one of the common responses we see is something that we ultimately call broad encouragement. And so that's a statement along the lines of, I know things are tough for you right now, but I know you can get through this. Was that comment helpful? Is that typical of what goes on in these platforms? One of the things we found out that while this behavior is common and this approach to try and offer peer support is used quite often, it's actually not even the most common expression of support on these platforms. In fact, the most common strategy that individuals use is they relate things to their own personal experience, their own life and their own personal experiences. So, ultimately what we're trying to do is identify behaviors of peers that are supportive of individuals. So in terms of translating that to a data science problem, we are going to take post and comment characteristics, so things like the actual text as well as characteristics of the users, put them in a machine learning model and try and identify whether or not a particular comment was helpful or not. So that leads us to our sort of next challenge is how do we define helpfulness? In the ideal state of the world, you can imagine that there are a couple of sets of outcomes you might want to look at. One is professionally annotated data by a clinician or psychologist. Another is some sort of revealed preference measure, asking individuals, was that comment helpful to you? And the third is you might be able to look at some sort of mental health assessment. Unfortunately, many of these tools don't really scale when you're talking about a platform of hundreds of thousands of users. So instead, we leaned on the social network analysis literature and looked at social media signals as a proxy of helpfulness. For instance, this might be something like you post an expression of frustration and a user responds and you like that comment, or you say, give a general expression of gratitude by saying thank you, that really helped. Or perhaps when you express your mood on the following day, we can detect a noticeable elevation. Now, one of the things that we want to be very clear and transparent about is that these measures can be problematic, that when a person likes something, it might not necessarily be because it's helpful, but because it's funny, or just because you already have a pre-existing social relationship with that person. And in addition to this, one of the challenges that we have with this platform is that the median user is only on the platform for 2 days. So to the extent that we're interested in measuring long-term health outcomes and long-term changes in mental health, that's quite frankly very tricky. So one of the things that we did look at as to examine the face validity of these measures is we looked at how often they occur. And if you believe this as a measure of helpfulness, they actually occur quite often. So nearly half of all posts eventually have some expression associated of some expression of gratitude associated with it. That being said, one of the things that we would have liked to have seen is that these gestures and measures of gratitude tended to co-occur. And in fact, what we see is that they really don't. That typically you want to see an interclass correlation of around 0.6 or higher. And here we see that it's actually around 0.23. So what that means is that what we define as our key measure of helpfulness is actually a very faithful choice. But before we get into that, what I want to emphasize is that we also want to identify something tractable and intelligible to provide back to this platform, to identify strategies that might be helpful, as well as behaviors that might be able to be encouraged on this type of platform. And we sort of group this into 2 broad categories. There's sort of specific words and dialogic moves that an individual could make. That might be doing something like saying you're strong, or brave, or resilient, or empowered. Or there could be specific behaviors that a peer could make. And what we thought would be most applicable is if we could identify behaviors of clinicians and map that to the types of moves that these peers made. And that's exactly what we did. We contacted a colleague at the University of Utah, and he provided us with a machine learning model that was trained on clinical data to predict the presence of certain clinical moves. Specifically, these moves are called ORs. And what they correspond to are 4 broad sets of strategies with regards to how you interact with patients. These are the usage of open questions. How does that make you feel? Affirmations. Reflective commentary, and summarizing the individual's thoughts. And what we see is when we sort of map these measures into a peer support space, is that the distribution of these strategies and tools are quite different than that of traditional counseling. Specifically, I want you to focus on that top blue bar, and that is a strategy called giving information. Typically, this behavior is very rare in counseling sessions, but it represents nearly half of all activity on a peer support platform. So one of the sort of immediate takeaways that we should understand when examining these types of tools is that peer counseling and clinical counseling are not the same. With that, I'm going to hand things off to my colleague Shweta.
So coming off of that understanding of our platform and the way that we've decided to operationalize our analysis, we're going to delve into some of the findings from our research over the summer. Just as a reminder, we're going to be using the terms helpful and not helpful over the course of the rest of the presentation. And so when we're talking about helpfulness, we're specifically talking about these proxies or like likes, follows, and expressions of gratitude. And so though over the course of the summer we ran our models on each of these proxies individually, for the course of this presentation, the results that we're presenting are basically looking at the outcome of any of the above, which means that any one of these proxies was present for a particular comment in the data. And so when I say helpful, that basically means when I say that a comment was found to be helpful, that means that it was more likely to have one of these proxies present. And when we say not helpful, that basically means it was not as likely to have these proxies present. So before we dive into insights from the language used on these platforms, we wanted to look at user characteristics because it's not just important what was said, but also who said it. So it is possible that there are just some users who are more likely to receive these proxies like likes and follows than others. And what we found in our data was that female users, younger users, and those who generally had larger networks, followed more people and were followed by more people, were more likely to receive the proxies that we're looking at. We then wanted to dive into looking at counseling behaviors. So the behaviors, the motivational interviewing techniques that we identified, we wanted to see if peers actually make use of these techniques, does that actually result in more helpful outcomes? And what we found was that while simple reflection, affirmations, and summarization was positively correlated to more helpful outcomes, open questions were not found to be helpful on the platform. This initially confused us, but when we looked at it closely, we realized that just the nature of the platform and the nature of our analysis has a lot to do with this. So while traditional counseling is a much longer process of back and forth conversation between a counselor and a client, their open questions are used to extract more information about a client's circumstances. So when you think about a peer support platform where you're really dealing with users who you don't know, usually have just one interaction with them, there an open question is not the kind of comment that would elicit likes or follows as a result. And so that is why we think that we found this particular result. Going into the actual language and words used on the platform, we looked at comments to understand what kind of comments are people finding to be helpful and what they're not finding to be helpful. So on the positive end of the spectrum, we found that affirmative language, encouraging language, pushing people to fight through their struggles, and offering availability, offering to speak to somebody in case they need someone to talk to, were found to be helpful sorts of techniques on the platform. On the other hand, we found that the use of more flippant, casual language, as well as a lot of use of negating language, particularly the word don't showed up a lot, was found not to be helpful. And when we specifically dug deeper in our analysis on posts that were of a more serious and critical nature, dealing with suicide and self-harm, what we found was that a lot of negating language was actually users who were dissuading their peers from engaging in self-harm, using language like don't end your life, reconsider that. That's a permanent solution to a temporary problem. But we found that that was not really correlating well with our helpfulness indicators. And this provided us with an important insight into the nature of peer support platforms and what they can and what they can't offer. So what peer support does seem to do well is offer a place to make connections, to feel heard, to feel understood. But in more critical circumstances, there is a limit to what untrained peers can really offer in terms of support. Besides the actual words and language used on the platform, we also created a few features from the text ourselves. And some of those that came out to be interesting were that longer comments tended to correlate positively with our helpfulness measures. Maybe that indicates some kind of increased level of thoughtfulness or effort on the part of a commenter. And we also found that the use of second-person pronouns, so language that is directed towards you rather than I, where the commenter is talking more about the person who needs help rather than themselves, was found to be more helpful. In terms of how our models did across all of our different outcome measures, we had an accuracy ranging between 58 to 62%, and our bag of words models performed a lot better than the models where we used the features that we had engineered. And so this reveals that there is some amount of explainability within the text itself in terms of these helpful measures that we're looking at, but there is a lot still that we haven't been able to capture within the model, and there is a lot of complexity at play on a platform like this. And so some of that could be just subjective content about what are the user circumstances, what is the user going through on the platform. When we dug deeper into posts that were of a more critical nature, where people were talking of suicide and self-harm, we actually found that those individuals were less likely to use any of our helpfulness proxy measures across the board. And other factors like social network dynamics, like how many people are posting at the same time as me, what is really popular, what is getting attention, are all factors that would affect the results of an analysis like this. And so we're hopeful that further research into this will find better ways to incorporate these complexities into that analysis. And we also want to just reiterate that we understand that these are proxies that we're looking at, and these proxies are far from perfect measures of helpfulness itself. And so we're hopeful that further research will look at more robust measures of helpfulness that come from surveys or annotation, so that we can see whether the findings that we have really translate into that space as well. With that, I'll pass it back to Kelly to go over the takeaways from the summary.
Last week we met with Charisse Williams, who's the Assistant Director of UW's Counseling Center. As a professional mental health therapist, she, of course, shared with us some of her concerns over these platforms. And so to conclude, I'd like to walk you through her take on the platforms combined with our research and our observations. So first of all, to reiterate once again, we need better ways to measure helpfulness. As we discussed, there were a lot of caveats for the proxy measurements that we used, and further research would be needed to determine whether or not these proxies match up with mental health, what the mental health world considers to be helpful both short-term and long-term. Since these platforms are targeted towards mental health, though, being able to assess mental health standards, being able to assess helpfulness by mental health standards should be a key part of further investigation and platform design. Secondly, we need better and more moderation. So on the platform that we studied, moderators are unpaid, trained volunteers, and administrators are employees. And they are both responsible for removing content that contains dangerous, unsafe, or violent acts. Actually measuring the percentage of posts that contains this type of content is very complex, but based on our own calculations, we estimate that at least 10% of the mental health content posted on the platform was about suicide or self-harm alone, not including other types of posts that could fall into the category of dangerous, unsafe, or violent. When we look at just this content that is related to suicide and to self-harm, we found that only 2.5% was deleted by an admin or moderator. Research into non-suicidal self-injury as well as suicidal contagion has demonstrated that access to this type of content can be triggering and even incite this type of behavior. So the fact that this much suicidal content and self-injury content is staying on the website is hugely problematic. Thirdly, peer support is not suitable for all mental health problems. As Shweta mentioned, our analysis into the content of posts suggested that posts related to building community, to feeling heard, and to being encouraged were more appropriate for a peer support platform. And research into peer support does back up that idea. In formal settings such as psychiatric hospitals, peer support is a tool that's usually used in conjunction with professional services, rather than alone. Individuals experiencing serious mental health challenges simply need more than what peer support can offer. Furthermore, without training into how to maintain an appropriate and healthy emotional distance and to avoid compassion fatigue, peer supporters shouldn't be attempting to manage these complex issues by themselves. Platforms need to be more upfront with users about this fact, especially if there is not a professional moderator who is there to take over when the content starts to become above the level that is appropriate for a peer supporter. Lastly, we need much better ways to deal with suicidal content. Since 2013, suicide has been the second leading cause of death for individuals from age 10 to 34. If you have a platform that is about mental health, you are going to have content that is about suicide. This is a huge problem and one that needs to be a priority in design. Simply deleting the post or sending the users the phone number for the suicide hotline is not enough. If users are coming to the platform looking for support, which the platform claims to give them, they need to also follow through with that by helping them through this process. The data that we looked at this summer was not just numbers and strings of text. It was pleas for help from a population that we have not done enough to support. Our most vulnerable populations are using these platforms with little accountability and oversight. When we talked with Sharice Williams, the assistant director of UW's Counseling Center, she said one thing that really stuck with all of us. Whenever she goes into a counseling session, her goals are as follows. First, do no harm, then try to help. To the existing peer support platforms and mental health tech, this should be where you start. To the researchers that are looking at their data, this should be what you prioritize. And to anyone who is interested in, motivated by, or attempting to do data science for social good, this should be where you start. You cannot fix a problem until you understand it. You cannot help unless you first understand how to not help, not harm. Thank you.
Sure. At the risk of overly simplifying, how are these businesses profitable? Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, like what is the business?
Okay. Well, like any sort of social media platform, they rely partly on advertisements. And in addition to that, the platform has microtransactions. So for instance, pieces of flair, emojis, those sorts of things, those are one component of how the company monetizes its users and its interactions.
How do you consider this? Do you think companies may be incentivized to increase engagement no matter no matter how that might be related to mental health and so on, and users prepared how this kind of language might interact with key performance indicators that most social media marketing
is a really deep question, and again, I wanna make sure you do it justice. Is that are these sort of peer counseling platforms engaged in sort of contradictory or at least conflicting incentives where they want to retain their users? I think that's a common concern in almost every element and aspect of mental health. I think it's nothing new in the sense that that has been a critique of traditional therapy, that some people have that perception. I think at the end of the day, most firms have some sort of mix of goals between both executing social good as well as achieving profitability. I really can't get into the specifics because we have yet to really engage with the firm on their views and their values, though. But I think it's a very real risk, and it's something that we are definitely mindful of and have discussed intensively amongst our team.
Earlier when you were talking about the accuracy of that one score of your model, and how it was doing on labeling helpful versus not helpful, I believe that's what the task was. Was there any attempt to sort of stratify into time segments? Because I can imagine that over time, what might be helpful at one point becomes overused, and users don't like it. I don't know if there's any attempt to look at that, or if that's possible.
So we did really, yeah. So the question is basically about whether we try to stratify our analysis to look at whether helpfulness and what is not helpful and not helpful changes over time. When we actually filtered our data set, we filtered it down to just one particular time period of 2018 itself. So by the time we got to running our models, they were taking very long to run, and so we filtered our data set down. So we weren't really able to do that kind of analysis, but it's definitely something that would be interesting to look at. The question is just about how did we filter our data set down and get rid of the social media content and decide what was relevant. So when a user makes a post on this platform, they actually select like a mood to begin with. And so there are negative and positive moods there that they pick, and they also pick like a category for the post that they're creating. So those were 2 points of reference that we had based on which we were able to filter. Along with that, we used dictionaries basically of negative emotion words. So we collected those, and there are also certain trigger words that the platform itself identifies, which helps them identify individuals who are going through serious crisis. So we basically created like a dictionary of all of these words together. And the data set that we were really interested in was where users are actually dealing with mental health challenges and are actually asking for help. So that really became our focus.
Yeah, with regards to the first part about what are sort of the other positive alternative outcomes we looked at, one of the things that we really did, and one of the things I really appreciate about the DSSG program, is we interviewed many stakeholders from similar types of firms and entities. Specifically, we talked to crisis counselors, we talked to people who worked at suicide hotlines, and one of the things that really sort of surprised us in terms of what they used as their outcome was whether or not a person hung up the phone with their own agency and own willingness. And it's something that we've been thinking about a lot in terms of mapping what a good, high-quality, long-term outcome would be. But we haven't really explored that space. Kelly, do you want to answer the second part?
To the second part about professional help, the short answer is no. So when somebody posts something that is categorized as suicidal on the platform, other users are encouraged to tag that post for removal and to provide them with a suicide hotline, but that's kind of the extent. They have a resources page that they have that you can navigate to that says, here are some options. That being said, I'm going to go a little rogue here. If we go back to I just want to draw attention to this because I think it's really important. One of the concerns about peer support platforms is that if they dissuade people from getting professional help. And if you look at the comments on the right-hand side, the ones that don't show up with our helpfulness indicators, there are actually a lot of comments that talk about, for example, clinical therapy, seek help. And that is, again, as we talk for a real need for further research, that could be indicative of a bigger problem we don't really know, right? But another thing just to mention.
And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank all of our Data Science for Social Good student fellows, the project leads and the data scientists who make these teams and this work possible, as well as, once again, the great numbers of sort of staff members who are involved in various ways in this program. So if we could all give a round of applause to them. I expect you're all as amazed as I am at what they're able to produce in 10 weeks, much of which the first 2 weeks, if you ask them, are spent in a lot of tutorials and other kinds of activities. So it's pretty remarkable. I hope you'll all join us. We have a reception up in the WRF Data Science Studio, which is just across the courtyard here up in the Physics Astronomy Tower on the 6th floor. We will have food and beverages and opportunities to interact with the fellows and ask them your more detailed questions and maybe play around with their apps. Thanks.